Oh man, let me explain about my marriage. My wife Hilly and I have been united for nearly 20 years now. Can you believe it? Our anniversary is approaching fast on December 10th. And let me say, I wouldn't alter a single aspect of our life together. Certainly, we've encountered our fair share of disagreements. But the reconciliation, oh, it was always so rewarding. That's just how we functioned. Initially, there was this one challenging period, like in our second year together, but other than that, it's been a smooth journey. We committed ourselves, young me at 20 and Hilly at just 18. We had known each other since childhood, living just around the block from each other. My older brother, Bob, had married Hilly's sister, Pam, a year earlier, so it seemed like the natural next step for us. The challenge was that Bob and Pam had a baby within their first year of marriage, but we weren't as fortunate. We underwent tests, even though the doctors advised us not to worry and to let things happen naturally, but Hilly's mom kept urging us to start a family. She was always like that, particularly since she had only daughters besides Pam. My mother-in-law, Jan, was eager for a grandson, having had only daughters herself. The test results were uncertain Hilly was fine, but I had a slightly low sperm count or something of that sort. Honestly, I never fully understood all the details. The doctors reassured us that the situation wasn't too serious and that everything was fine. They advised us to be patient and assured us that our first baby would come when the time was right. Although we tried to be patient, the pressure did put some strain on our marriage. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait too long. In our third year of marriage, Hilly gave birth just as the doctor had predicted. Linda arrived, a beautiful baby girl. It eased our worries about whether we could have children, and from then on, everything settled down and our marriage became even stronger. We were more relaxed about it all. Soon after, Hilly became pregnant again, and finally, Tom was born a son. The whole family was ecstatic. This doesn't mean we loved our daughters any less, but having a son felt extra special for us. I was the first to have a son, and I proudly told my big brother about it. He just smiled and told me to give him time. Well, he got his chance, and sure enough, the following year they had their first son too. 8 months later, we welcomed another son, Mike. It was like buses you wait for ages, and then several come at once. With 2 brothers and 2 sisters, we lived like one big happy family. Even when Hilly's other sisters got married, they became part of our close-knit family too. It was wonderful for the children, and we always had someone to watch them when we needed. From what I could tell, the other couples were just as happy as Hilly and me, enjoying the simple joys of married life surrounded by a loving family. We faced a few challenges, like when Bob had his work accident, and I felt like I was right there with him as they transfused my blood into him. He recovered, and I was fine too. We often joked in a brotherly way that we were now truly blood brothers. As our 20th anniversary approached, we wondered how to celebrate it. Bob and Pam had celebrated theirs the year before, and we all had such a great time that we decided to do something similar. We booked a private room at the local hotel for a big gathering of family and friends. But then there was Linda, a beautiful 17-year-old girl, a younger and perhaps even prettier version of her mother. She had shiny dark brown hair and big green eyes that always caught your attention. She had a similar figure, too slim, with nice legs and other features that maybe a father shouldn't think about too much. She naturally had a string of boyfriends, and the house always seemed to have one of them around, but she was level-headed, so we just rolled with it. Tom, I always thought, took after me a bit, solidly built, and it suited him. He loved rugby, just like Bob and I did at his age, and at almost 16, he was already a regular player at fly half for his school's first team. Then there was young Mike, the youngest. Maybe he was going through a tough time, not being as good at sports as Tom or as popular as Linda. Poor Mike wasn't having the greatest time, but nothing serious. He was very smart, probably even smarter than the other 2, and did very well in school. He was just acting like a typical, totally confusing teenager. That day, maybe I should have been more understanding. Maybe I should have ignored the mess he left on the dining table. Maybe I should have just cleaned it up for him. But did I? No, you're not going out until you've cleaned up that mess, Mike, I told him firmly. I'll do it later, he replied, sulking. You'll do it now, Mike, I said firmly. Why are you always picking on me? He shouted back, losing his temper. I'm not, I replied sharply. You're part of this family, and you'll follow our rules, like everyone else. Who's going to make me? Mike nearly cried, really losing his temper. I will, I retorted, starting to lose my patience. I'm your father, and you'll do as I say. My father, he yelled back. You sure about that? I froze, stunned by his words, my next words stuck in my throat. Sorry, Dad, Mike quickly said, his face pained. Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to say that. I'll clean it up right away with that. He looked away from me and quickly cleared the table, gathering the books and other items he had left there. Within minutes, everything was cleared, and he hurried out of the room without saying another word, leaving me lost in my thoughts, wondering if my world was about to fall apart. The problem, of course, was that Mike had always been so different from the other two, more studious, more serious, but less outgoing than his older siblings. I often wondered why he was so different and had even discussed it with Hilly, but she just shrugged and told me I was imagining things. Was I? Had I been? What made Mike say that? If he had just yelled it in anger and walked away, I would have been upset, but that would have been it. But he was so quick to apologize and take back his words. Why? What did he know that I didn't? Oh no, I didn't want to entertain the thoughts racing through my troubled mind at that moment. My first instinct was to go find Hilly and demand answers, but what good would that do? What would I say? I couldn't just accuse her of cheating on me. If she had, she'd deny it, and if she hadn't, how would she ever forgive me for doubting her? Besides, it had been 16 years or more ago, but did that even matter? Was it still happening? My stomach churned, and I felt nauseous, and I still didn't know if I had reason to worry. Oh God, what a terrible day it was. Blood types, that's it, I thought. Without hesitation, I went to our study and found the kids' medical records. Linda, Tom, and Mike all O positive, which, from donating blood to my brother, I knew was the same as mine. I felt a sense of relief until it dawned on me that blood types didn't tell the whole story. If Mike had a different type, that would be one thing, but them all having the same group could just be a coincidence and didn't confirm that he was truly my son. Oh dear, what should I do? DNA. I couldn't believe I was considering such an extreme measure over one angry comment from my son. I was overreacting, but when Mike avoided eye contact during dinner that evening and left the table without a word, my concern grew. What's wrong with Mike? Hilly asked, noticing his odd behavior too. No clue, I replied, shrugging. Do you guys know? They shook their heads, seemingly unaware. Has he been upset about anything? I asked, but they shook their heads again. Once the kids left the table, I gathered the courage to ask my wife. Mike seems so different from the other two. Hilly, I began. Any thoughts on why? Let's not dwell on that, Davy, she replied, getting up to clear the dishes. He's just a bit deeper than the others. End of story. Was she avoiding the topic deliberately, or was she genuinely unconcerned? I couldn't understand why I shouldn't look into DNA testing. 20 minutes later, I found myself researching it online. An hour later, my mind was overflowing with details, yet I was still far from finding an answer. It wasn't until Monday morning that I finally discovered a laboratory capable of conducting the test. It took me nearly an hour, and my secretary might have managed it faster. But how do you explain to your secretary why you need a lab test? That's why I handled it myself. The lab was ready to proceed without any issues, though it was costly, particularly if I needed the results promptly. However, I needed to know before I risked damaging my marriage. When I mentioned that I needed the information before jeopardizing my marriage, they recommended that I send samples from all 3 of my children for comparison, along with one of mine. Have you ever tried to obtain a hair sample from your adult children? It's not straightforward, I assure you, and with Mike avoiding me as much as possible, It was the most challenging, but I accomplished it. I sent them off, and now all I could do was wait to discover if Mike was indeed my son. Over the next week, Mike appeared more relaxed, probably relieved that I hadn't mentioned his outburst. We nearly reached a point where I felt I could gently discuss it with him, but I decided it was best to await the results. Now that I had embarked on this path, my wife continued to be her usual affectionate self, and nothing else altered in our daily lives. It might not have been the most fervent love we shared during those days, but I did not refuse her. Doubts gnawed at me internally, and although I strove to conceal it from Hilly, I couldn't engage in intimacy without wondering if someone else had been involved during our 20 years of marriage. One evening, while dining with my brother and his wife, and when he and I had a moment alone, I nearly shared my concerns with him. We were so similar in nearly every way, so if someone else fathered Mike, it logically couldn't have been him. Why was I even considering such thoughts? Was I becoming paranoid? But something prevented me from burdening him with my doubts, and deep down, I knew he would support me if the results were unfavorable. I remained calm, stayed silent, and kept so quiet that Hilly inquired a few times if everything was all right. I reassured her, stating I had some things on my mind. She looked concerned briefly, but didn't press further. The results arrived, and I had them sent to my office just in case Hilly reached them before me and opened the envelope. With trembling hands, I read the letter, trying to comprehend its content. Would this document signal the end of my marriage? Upon reading it, it appeared that Mike's results matched mine, and I felt a wave of relief, although I didn't fully grasp it since medical jargon was like gibberish to me. The report mentioned terms like good match and close match, so it seemed my worries were baseless. What a relief. Tears welled up in my eyes as I silently thanked my fortunate stars that I hadn't confided my fears in Hilly. I decided to make it up to her that evening by taking her out to dinner, and afterward, upon re-examining the cover letter, which I had initially overlooked, I noticed that the lab had asked me to call them to discuss the results. I assumed they merely wanted to extract some extra money from me, and I was unsure if it was worth the hassle. When the phone was answered, I introduced myself as Davy Jones and mentioned that Dr. Hoskins had requested I call. After providing some references, I finally got through to the doctor. "Hello, Mr. Jones," he greeted me. "Have you had a chance to review the results we sent you?" "Yes," I replied confidently. "It seems my concerns about my son Mike were baseless." "Yes, indeed," he responded. "But it's not quite that simple, I'm afraid," he added, and my heart sank as I awaited him to deliver the unsettling news. "You mean he might not be my son?" I stammered. "It's not that, Mr. Jones," he explained. He explained that there's less than a 1 in a million chance that this child is not your biological son. I'm sure that he is your natural-born son. 11/12, so Mike is my real son. I sighed in relief. "Yes, he is, Mr. Jones." "Then what's the issue?" I asked, feeling unsure. What else could be wrong? I was beginning to worry because I had heard that DNA tests could also detect genetic conditions. "It's the other 2 samples you submitted," the doctor stated gravely. "What about the samples from your son's brother and sister?" I inquired, feeling a surge of panic. "Is there something wrong with one of them?" "Well, it appears that they are only half-siblings to your youngest son, Mr. Jones," the doctor elaborated. "Half-siblings?" I stuttered in astonishment. "What does that mean, doctor? What's a half-sibling?" "It means, Mr. Jones," he continued, "that it's highly unlikely that you are their biological father." The phone slipped from my hand, and the next thing I knew, I was surrounded by my concerned colleagues as I tried to regain consciousness. "Give him some air," someone shouted as I slowly came to, gasping for air. "Are you okay, Davy?" another voice inquired, and I nodded weakly, trying to stand. They assisted me back to my seat, discussing among themselves about the workload and the office temperature. It all seemed so minor compared to the shock I had just experienced. Thankfully, someone arranged for me to be driven home and urged me to take the rest of the day off. Grateful to find the house empty upon my arrival with my wife at work and the kids at school, I knew what I had to do next. I dreaded making the call, but I knew I had to do it. With trembling fingers, I dialed the laboratory's number again, and soon I was speaking with the doctor once more, apologizing for the abrupt end of our previous conversation. "No worries, Mr. Jones," he reassured me. "Our postal service can be challenging to navigate at times." I assured him that I understood, and he patiently reviewed the test results with me once more. "Mike is definitely your son," he confirmed, "but Linda and Tom are unlikely to be your biological children." "But the results showed good or close matches," I pleaded. "Could there be a mistake?" "If we had only one sample, we might request another for verification," he explained, "but with two samples, the likelihood is nearly certain. While Linda and Tom are full siblings, it's improbable that you are their father." "But you said the matches were close," I insisted, clinging to a glimmer of hope. "What does that mean? Do you have a twin or a brother, Mr. Jones?" the doctor cautiously inquired. "Or perhaps another relative?" "My brother," I exclaimed, a surge of excitement coursing through me. "What does my brother have to do with this situation?" "You'll have to come to your own conclusions, Mr. Jones," the doctor's voice droned on, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My world had suddenly shattered into pieces. What should I do now? End my marriage? Sever my lifelong bond with my brother? You can't choose your family after all. Should I just pretend I didn't know anything? Keep living a lie? I couldn't bear it. And what about Mike? He knew something was wrong, but he had the wrong idea. From now on, I'd see my son in a different way. But I couldn't love Linda and Tom any less. They were my kids, no matter whose genes they carried, and no piece of paper could change that. But what about my wife? That was the real question. What about that woman and my jerk of a brother too, and Pam, my sister-in-law? How would they react to the news? How would the rest of the family handle it? So many questions were swirling in my head. Oh God, this was all so complicated, and I didn't feel ready to deal with it. I vaguely remember stepping out of the front door and starting to walk down the street, but the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital with bandages all over my arms. I had stumbled in front of a car while completely intoxicated, but I didn't remember any of that at the time. "Davy, are you all right?" I turned to see who had asked, but it was excruciatingly painful. Then I recognized the voice and realized it was my ex-wife speaking to me. "Not really, not yet anyway," I replied. She was still my wife. I didn't say much. I couldn't find the right words. What was I supposed to say? "Hey honey, just found out 2 of our kids aren't mine, and you've been fooling around with my brother. How was your day? What's for dinner?" Yeah, that didn't sound quite right, did it? Anyway, it turned out my injuries weren't too serious, and they sent me home the next day. I couldn't do much for myself, so I relied on Hilly to take care of me. It gave me time to think, time to plan. But honestly, it felt like a waste of time because I still didn't know what to do. The main concern now was Mike and the other 2 kids. Whatever decision I made had to be in their best interest, even if it meant sacrificing my own. Hilly's needs came last from then on. All I knew was our 20th anniversary was coming up, and the room was booked for our big dinner. I had to figure things out by then. Within about a week, I was more or less back to normal, at least physically. Everything seemed to fall back into place while I contemplated my next move. But Mike was different. He seemed like he was on edge, just the right age to act out. "You should talk to him," Davy Hilly said one evening. "I don't know what's bothering him. He doesn't seem to want to talk to me anymore. I'll have a chat with him, I promised." "Any idea what's going on with him?" she asked me. "I've got a few ideas," I said shortly. "Want to talk about them, Davy?" she asked. "Not really," I replied, catching her off guard. The chance came the next day when I found him alone in his room, and he couldn't avoid me. "Want to talk about what's bothering you, son?" I began gently. He just shook his head, not wanting to open up. "Is it about the other day, Mike?" "About our relationship," I pressed, noticing a maturity in him that surprised me. "You don't understand, Dad," he challenged me. "I might know more than you think, son," I countered, trying to keep a smile on my face. "Then why don't you do something about it?" "Dad," he pushed back. "Why do you let them get away with it, Wade? This wasn't going the way I expected. It seemed like we were talking about something else entirely. Get away with what, son? I asked, confused. You really don't know, Dad, he repeated. Apparently not, son, I admitted. It's Mum and Uncle Tim, Dad, he whispered. When you're at work, once a month or so, it's so embarrassing. Uncle Tim. Darn it, I muttered under my breath. Tim wasn't Hilly's husband, he was married to another one of Hilly's sisters. Oh, that, I mumbled pathetically, unable to think of anything else to say. They've been doing it for years, Dad, my son, informed me solemnly. Linda thinks I'm Tim's son, not yours with that. He broke down in tears, and I wrapped my arms around him to comfort him. It had been a long time since I'd done that, and I was surprised by how big and strong my little boy felt. I can guarantee you, Mike, I assured him as I continued to hold him, you are my son in every way, not Tim's. How do you know, Dad? He sobbed. How can you be sure I'm sure? Son, I told him. Confidently. Believe me, I'm sure we talked for a while longer, and without revealing too much, I managed to convince him of his true parentage. It was like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. However, my brother's involvement as the father of Linda and Tom was not mentioned, revealing that my supposedly perfect family was not as content as I had thought. Both Linda and Tom were aware of their mother's affair with their uncle, but opted to ignore it, unsure of how to address the situation. It was a dreadful position to place them in. As for Tim, he was the youngest of the 4 sisters and unquestionably the most attractive, while Hilly had her charms. Tim's wife added another layer of complexity to my already strained marriage. A few days later, I took all 3 kids out for lunch and did the most challenging thing I've ever had to do. I disclosed everything I had discovered. Throughout the day, I anxiously awaited their reactions, fearing the worst. Surprisingly, they handled the news relatively well. Linda shed a few tears and Tom sat with his head in his hands, clearly distraught. Despite their initial shock, all 3 expressed a desire to confront their mother immediately. However, I convinced them to hold off as I needed to sort out a few things first. All 3 of them pledged their love and loyalty to me and were close to cutting ties with Hilly for good. I managed to dissuade them from that, reminding them that despite her mistakes, she had always been a caring mother to them. I spoke about her in a way that didn't quite match my true feelings, especially after hearing the kids' revelations. According to them, Hilly, my supposedly loving wife, had been involved in some kind of relationship with her brother-in-law, Tim, for a while. However, it probably wasn't long enough for him to be Mike's father. The once-a-month claim might have been an exaggeration too, but none of us was certain. One thing was clear, though the kids felt relieved to finally share their birth burden, and all 3 of them shed tears, yes. Even Tom joined in as we gathered together that evening. Let me correct that last statement, all 4 of us shed tears. I craved revenge, but I had to find a way to seek it without causing pain to my children. And yes, I chose my words carefully. I meant it when I said I needed revenge, for him and for my children. I pondered for a while but couldn't come up with a grand scheme for revenge. It seemed like a direct confrontation was my only option. Luckily, I had the upcoming event to do just that. On the 10th of December, our family had gathered as families do. With my parents gone, Bob and I were among the older ones that night. 39 of us sat down for the celebratory dinner, mainly Hilly's side of the family, along with some of our mutual friends. They said the meal was good, but for me, it might as well have been cardboard and dishwater. Then came the speeches. Here we go, I thought. Was it the end, or perhaps just the beginning? I was sweating buckets and trying to calm my nerves with deep breaths. What I had to do wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done. Welcome everyone, I began, starting with some small talk. Then I steered the conversation towards celebrating 20 years of marriage with my wife, Hilly, but there were some very interesting and personal things about our marriage that I needed to share with everyone, and that's where things were about to get interesting. Laughter filled the room, and there were a few jokes about our bed life. Hilly blushed, thinking it was all in good fun, but little did they know how mistaken they were. As the laughter settled, Linda stood up, abruptly followed by Tom, and then Mike. Without a word to anyone, the whole table watched, bewildered and curious about what was going on. "Come back here, all three of you," Hilly exclaimed, jumping up. "Don't be disrespectful to your father." Only Tom glanced back at his mother with a sad shake of his head before joining his siblings outside. David Hilly called to me, desperate for me to intervene. "Do something. Tell them to come back right now." "It's all right, dear," I responded firmly. "They already know what I'm going to say, and since it concerns them, maybe it's best they're not here." Hilly looked shocked at my response, first surprised by my defiance, then worried as she tried to understand my motives. "Sit down, Hilly," I commanded firmly, my tone leaving no room for argument. As I was saying, I continued, scanning the faces around me. "I've had 20 years of what I thought was a perfect marriage, until a few weeks ago." I paused for effect, feeling the tension in the air. Some looked puzzled, others still wore smiles, expecting a joke, but many seemed concerned. Surprisingly, I went on. "Imagine my shock when no one spoke up, to discover that Linda, my beloved daughter, is not biologically mine." Hilly couldn't hold back her sobs, her hands covering her face, breaking the silence. "Would you like to tell everyone who Linda's real father is?" Hilly, I asked. But she remained silent, only her crying disturbing the quiet. "Fine." Then I pressed on. "Does anyone else want to confess who's been with my wife behind my back?" No one dared to speak, and I stood there, my gaze sharp and accusing, surveying the stunned faces of my family and friends. As terrible as it sounds, there was a strange satisfaction in exposing those who had deceived me. They had no idea how much I had uncovered. I couldn't resist giving my brother Bob a stern look, and he visibly squirmed under my gaze, knowing he had been caught. "No one's going to confess," I challenged them. "Do I have to reveal the truth?" Then, to my surprise, Bob's wife, Pam, stood up abruptly. "It's not what you think, Davy," she exclaimed, distressed. "It wasn't an affair. We just had love a few times to help Hilly get pregnant." The whole family had been eager for a boy, especially my mother, and it seemed doubtful that I could father a child. If someone had dropped a feather at that moment, it would have knocked me over. Pam knew. She knew about her husband, my brother, fathering my daughter. Looking around the table, I saw it divided into two camps. Some were shocked, while others seemed unsurprised. Friends who were unaware and family members who mostly seemed to be in the loop. As I stood there trying to collect myself, friends began to excuse themselves one by one, leaving around 17 or 18 of us. All relatives. "Why don't you go play over there?" suggested Julie, another of Hilly's sisters, and gradually the younger children were sent off. The teenagers were encouraged to leave too, but it seemed like they were glued to the scene, not willing to miss the drama. "Well, you all seem to know what's going on, don't you?" I exclaimed, looking around. "You're all aware of this mess, except maybe the kids here." A couple of husbands appeared confused, but nobody denied it. "Look," Davy, my brother, attempted to explain. "It's not what you think." I swear he seemed poised to say more, but my expression of pure anger silenced him instantly. "So you all knew that Bob slept with my wife and fathered Linda?" "Ha!" I demanded of the table. Nobody admitted it outright, but again, nobody denied it. "I swear it was just 3 times, Davy," Pam defended herself, her voice rising. Whose ridiculous idea was this anyway? I shouted angrily, my frustration growing. Once again, nobody dared to speak, but too many eyes shifted towards Jan, my mother-in-law. "I should have known," I muttered, acknowledging her role. "Thanks a lot, Mom," I said to her with a heavy heart. "Your desperation for a son has shattered my marriage." "No," Hilly finally intervened, her voice trembling. "Please, Davy, don't say that. I can't imagine life without you. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive one mistake?" "One mistake?" I echoed incredulously. "Just one mistake, yes, honey," Hilly pleaded tearfully. "It was only that one time. It seems so foolish now, but back then, Mom's plan made sense. And what about Tom?" I pressed her, my tone firm. "Well, he's yours, of course, Davy," she assured me. "Wrong," I corrected her sternly. "I've had a DNA test done, and his father is the same man as Linda's." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. "What are you saying?" David, Pam exclaimed in shock. "You heard me, Pam," I confirmed, not backing down. "If my dear brother there is Linda's father, then he's also Tom's father." Silence hung heavily in the air as this revelation sunk in. "You scoundrel," Pam snapped at her husband, her voice trembling with anger. "You promised me this wouldn't happen, and then you went off and slept with that woman again," Bob muttered, avoiding eye contact, clearly regretting his actions. "And you traitor," Pam yelled at Hilly, her voice seething with anger. "I agreed to let you have my husband just that one time, and then you continue sleeping with him." With that, she marched 3 steps towards her sister and slapped Hilly hard across the face. "You deceitful," she spat, striking repeatedly until someone intervened and pulled her away. Tears streamed down Pam's face as she was restrained. "Are you satisfied, Mom?" I demanded, glaring at Jan, but she remained expressionless. "So who else has been betraying me?" I challenged the room, locking eyes with Tim, who sat across from me. "You scoundrel," Julie screamed beside me, shocking me with her outburst. "It's true what they said. You did sleep with her that night at the party." Confusion filled the air as Julie turned to her husband, Ted, who sheepishly admitted to the accusation. "And you, my dear sister," Julie turned her fury towards Hilly. "Have you slept with all your brother-in-laws?" "You shameless woman." "Well, she certainly had her way with Tim over there," I interjected, a sense of satisfaction creeping in. Tim's feeble attempts to deny the accusations only fueled the chaos, leading to Julie delivering a swift blow to his nose. "Don't bother coming home tonight," she yelled at him. "In fact, don't ever come back." Pam unleashed her fury on Bob. "I'm divorcing you, and I never want to lay eyes on you again." The 3 upset sisters linked arms and headed for the door. "You're no sister of ours," they yelled back at Hilly as they stormed out. Feeling pleased now, Jan, I confronted my mother-in-law, but she remained stoic, staring straight ahead as Hilly continued to cry into her arms. Finally, my father-in-law, Alf, spoke up. "I'm sorry, Davy," Alf began, his voice heavy with regret. "If only I had known," he trailed off, unable to find the right words, but he was the only one who made any attempt at an apology. Then Brother Bob approached me, his hands outstretched, a look of profound shame on his face. "David," he stammered. "David, what can I say?" "Nothing, you scoundrel," I retorted, my words lacking real force. I swung at him, catching him on the chin with little strength behind it, yet the timing was perfect, and he stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and landing sprawled on the floor, making no effort to rise. That seemed to mark the end of the festivities as the atmosphere soured, draining the fun out of the evening. Hilly didn't return home that night, and after grabbing a few things, she never returned. The kids were adamant about not speaking to her for a while, despite my own feelings of hatred towards her. However, I had to prioritize the well-being of the kids. Eventually, they softened and allowed her back into their lives, but things were never the same. I remained dad while she became more like a distant figure. The family was torn apart. 2 of the sisters who left that night filed for divorce, leaving only Pam to stick with Bob. However, she gave him a rough time, believing in giving him a taste of his own medicine. Pam showed up a couple of nights later when the kids were out, and her intentions quickly became clear. Whether it was revenge or a way to get back at me, I never found out, but I certainly got my payback. There was no love or tenderness, we just engaged in a physical fray for hours. It felt strange, like being intimate with my wife, but different. Afterward, she thanked me and left. It was only months later that I discovered she had been doing the same with Bob's friends, one by one. Would their marriage survive this? I didn't have a clue, and honestly, it wasn't my concern, but I could imagine it being pretty rough for my brother. About 3 weeks later, one of my other sisters, the attractive one, gave me a call and asked me out for dinner. I agreed, and we went out, had a meal, chatted, flirted, kissed, and ended up in bed. However, this time it felt different. After the initial excitement, we shared a deeper connection, making love reminiscent of the early days with Hilly. I couldn't understand why Tim had strayed from his marriage, but it definitely wasn't due to any lack of desire for intimacy. Perhaps the sweetest twist was when Jan's long-suffering husband, Alf, had enough of her meddling. He bought a 40 FT yacht and spent the rest of his days sailing around Europe. It was quite convenient for me, and the kids. We often joined him for sailing trips, exploring places like the south of France, Majorca, and the Canary Islands, creating cherished memories. Linda crossed paths with a young Spaniard while sailing and eventually tied the knot with him. He hailed from a family that owned one of Europe's largest boat marinas, which turned out to be quite advantageous. As for the boys, they're taking their time and not rushing into marriage too soon, perhaps learning from their father's experience. They've got plenty of time ahead of them. As for me, I don't have much contact with Hilly, but the kids keep me updated. Apparently, she's taking life one day at a time and often inquires about me. I just nod in response. Oh, and as for my own love life, I'm considering giving marriage another shot, but this time I'm looking inward. There's mutual affection between us, but we're both a bit cautious. Time will tell. I want to be certain that I'm not getting married partly out of spite toward Hilly, although, I must admit, the thought of her reaction if I did tie the knot again brings a smile to my face.